Hello and welcome to another episode of Local Government Stories. My guest this week isn't one for seeking the limelight, so I was really delighted when he agreed to take part. Stuart Love leads a council that sits at the heart of our capital. Over 31 million visitors pass through it each year, and it's home to the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, 10 Downing Street, Oxford Street, and I can go on, and has more businesses within its border than any other London borough. It's fair to say it's firmly part of the UK PLC brand on a global scale. It is, of course, Westminster Council. Stuart became the chief executive here in 2018, and just to give you an idea of the scale, he has an organisational budget of 1.5 billion and a workforce of over 3,500 people. So, with that introduction, welcome, Stuart. How are you doing today?
Thanks very much, Nez. I'm doing well, thank you. Very, very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And Stuart, I'm just conscious I've listed off a whole load of places that will be familiar to our audience, and actually, as I say, globally. But tell us something that people won't necessarily know about Westminster.
I think one of the things that people don't often realise about Westminster is the levels of deprivation we have. So we have extreme wealth alongside extreme poverty. And the statistic you mentioned about the I think you said 35 million visitors a year, we have over and above our resident population, around about 1 million people a day will come into the city. 700,000 of those come here to work. And then we have another 300,000 that are visitors, effectively, tourists. So the pressures on our services come from both our resident population as well as the people who come into our city every day. And we have a responsibility for both of those. We have a responsibility to our residents, obviously, but I firmly believe we have a responsibility to the people who come into the city. But sorry, just going back to the key part of your question, I think it's that issue of deprivation in Westminster that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily associate with us.
Yeah, there's something like a 10-year difference in life expectancy across certain wards, as there is in many places, but I think it's more stark here, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually worse than 10 years. And this is something, again, I just feel so strongly about. So if you're a man in Church Street, which is one of the most deprived wards in the country, versus a man in Hyde Park, which is, you could walk between the two in about 10 minutes. The life expectancy gap is 18 years on average, and there's all sorts of other things that underlie that. But what that speaks to is an issue of health inequality. And with that, there has to be a realization and acknowledgement of the role that local government has to play, because health inequality is not an issue for health. Health inequality has its roots in housing, education, economy, all of those things. So everything that we are responsible for as local government contributes to addressing health inequality. And that's just something, our whole approach in Westminster is about tackling inequality. The corporate strategy of Fairer Westminster, again, has addressing inequality at its heart.
Absolutely. We'll definitely come back to that. But thank you for that. And it's good for us to give people that wider lens of what they might perceive Westminster to be versus the reality that you as a council deal with every day. Well, Stuart, if it's okay, I'm going to take us right back to your early childhood, as I like to do, understand a bit more about your background. So tell us about those formative years and your experiences in your home place of South Africa.
Yeah, I was born in South Africa. First generation, my dad was Scottish and he immigrated to South Africa when he was 8. So born in South Africa, grew up there. Grew up during apartheid, which is something I'm sure we'll come back to at some point. First person in my family tree to go to university, still am. I studied economics and law. I was going to go on and do my LLB, and I just decided, actually, I'm done with studying. I want to experience a bit of the world and work. So started my career. My brother and my father both worked in the insurance industry, and I swore I wasn't going to go into the insurance industry. Of course, the first job I got was in the insurance industry because, people who my dad knew, etc. But it was good for me because I worked for a startup there were effectively 3 of us. And my boss at the time, she was an amazing person. And I still, regularly think about her all these years on in terms of her leadership and what I learned from her. So we were three people, and then we were bought by a major international insurance business. And I went at a very early stage in my career from being, the bottom of the rung of three to suddenly being responsible for leading and managing a pretty large team of people, because we were bought with the intention of the business that bought us, with the intention of obviously growing and expanding. And that was really good for me. Although I also do look, I don't know why, maybe it's an age thing, but I do look back at those days and sometimes cringe at my sort of leadership style then.
But you're so young, Stuart.
Yeah, I know.
University.
When I say I cringe, I think what's important to me is that I have learnt from that, and there was a lot of sort of leadership by textbook rather than authentic kind of. But yeah, I mean, I'm grateful for those opportunities, and as part of that takeover, actually, I was flown here to come and do some work with the head office of that business, the international head office of that business was in London. So I spent a couple of weeks doing work with them, helping them develop their technology, and yeah, I found, I mean, I've always loved London, and I think that first visit for me was just kind of really sold me on the place. It's centre of the world, so yeah.
Absolutely. So you did those first jobs, and then after 3 years, as I say, you became this general manager. You took on this leadership role, and then clearly you were here for business, and then you made the move to the UK. But I just want to go back a bit. You graduated in 1994, which was a really pivotal year for South Africa. It was the end of apartheid, the first proper elections, and of course Nelson Mandela. Yeah. Before we go into your career in London, tell us a little bit about what it felt like being a young man in that, well, what was a seismic, huge change.
Yeah. If over my shoulder is Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, and in that book he perfectly describes my upbringing 2 years before he was actually released from Robben Island. One of the warders would take him off the island on a Sunday, and he'd be in the car with this warder. They'd drive around Cape Town's white suburbs, and he'd often be left on his own in the car. And nobody expressly or explicitly said this to him at the time, but he realized afterwards that they were trying to sort of reintegrate him into what life would be like when he was released. But he said one of the things that he found so astonishing was looking around these white suburbs and seeing the families in the gardens, and the dad would be mowing the lawn, the mum would be watering the flowers, the kids would be running around and playing in the garden, completely oblivious to the political upheaval that was going on around them. And that was my upbringing. I was not politically aware. I have to say this is part of what drives me. I feel a lot of guilt because of that. And having said that, though, when I look back now, so that the first vote I ever had was the yes/no vote in terms of should everybody in South Africa be given the opportunity to vote rather than just white people. Yeah, that was my first. I always say I was on the right. I've voted in 2 referendums. I was on the right side of one, and the other didn't go the way I wanted it to. The other one being Brexit. So that referendum, South Africa voted overwhelmingly that we went down a full democratic route, and I worked the first properly democratic elections in South Africa. Volunteered, and I worked in a polling station, and it was brilliant. It was exciting. Yeah. I mean, I have flashbacks and memories of that time, and it was incredible. Yeah. I would love to sit here and say to you that South Africa voted to be a properly democratic country and to end apartheid because of the goodness of people's hearts and all of the rest. The truth is, a lot of what lay behind that were the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa and
political pressure globally.
Yeah, political and economic pressure. Yeah. And it's also why when we look at some of the things that are happening in the world at the moment, I think I appreciate this is a personal view, but I think I think sanctions are a tool that's no longer used, partly because the countries that potentially they'd be imposed on are too important economically to the rest of the world, whereas South Africa wasn't. But yeah, so that was a hugely exciting and formative time in my life.
Must have been really formative.
Yeah.
I just felt we couldn't not talk about that as we talk about your career, and as you say, really formative. And then you did actually make the move to the UK. Yeah. Tell us about what lay behind that. You clearly just loved London, and then you got your first job in local government right here at Westminster. Yeah. And Stuart is smiling very broadly at looking back at that. And it was about a cleansing business process manager and then a head of road management. So tell us about that and how you got that first job.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to say a bit before that, which is quite important. So the last job I had in South Africa was actually working for a company called Dimension Data Advanced Infrastructure. And I went from the insurance industry into the tech industry, basically. Right. And that business was blue chip South Africa, household name. But I was on the hard end of it. So, as you said, operations manager, leading a large blue collar workforce. We built computer rooms, did data cabling, things like that. When I was working for that business and South Africa implemented affirmative action, I saw the government implement affirmative action. I saw businesses, including the one that I was working for, take steps to find ways around. So it was a constant
undermining of
but also the government would catch up and close the loopholes. And one of the things I just found incredibly frustrating was watching these big businesses find ways. So, at the time in South Africa, I said I managed a large blue collar workforce, and stereotypically, and the white collar workforce was smaller and better paid rural white, and the blue collar workforce was rural global majority. And there's a much greater numbers. So immediately the business said, okay, we're fine in terms of representation. But then the government was up to that, and it has to be representation at all levels of the organisation, etc. And so it was just, being part of and seeing both the reaction from the businesses that I worked for and with. Again, I think it kind of taught me a lot of lessons in the space around what works and what doesn't, and also, where people are doing this for the wrong reasons, it can also have very poor outcomes. I immigrated to this country. One of the reasons for telling you that is there were two things that happened to me when I got here. The first one is I had this utopian vision of London as this rich, multicultural melting pot of, and I'm repeating actually words that Nelson Mandela used, stood in Trafalgar Square. And I came here, everybody gets on, and I came here and I was very, very quickly disabused of that.
What time? When was that?
2002.
Right. Okay.
So that was, I came over here October 2002.
Right.
People saw white South African man of a certain age and thought it was okay to be racist in front of me because no doubt I would be.
Be okay with that.
I was really shocked, and as I say, very, very quickly disabused of my views of London as this sort of utopian place. The second thing that happened to me was it was a massive lesson in humility. So I left South Africa with a very good CV, just got married, we sold 2 cars, a house, cashed in pensions, came over here, and I had this view that sort of people would be knocking on my door to offer me a job. We didn't come to jobs. We came over here to get jobs, and I didn't. No, I kept having recruitment agents saying to me, "You've got a great CV. We really like you. If we could get an interview for you, we're sure you'd be appointed. But nobody's heard of this Dimension Data business you worked for, and you've got no London experience." So it came within. I think we had £300 left in the bank account because of the exchange rate and everything else. My wife actually got a job before I did. So my first job was actually in the private sector.
Right.
And And I do want to tell the story again because I think it's important. It was working for an organisation that no longer exists called Phones for You. And
some of us will remember it.
Yes. And I was appointed by them to the plan was to get me into the head office, but in order to give me a little bit of experience with the business, they put me in their Tottenham Court Road shop. And I resigned after 6 days of being there, despite the fact that I had no money. And the HR director who'd appointed me called me up and asked me why I was leaving. And I said to her, in the 6 days I've worked for you, I've seen more racism, religious bigotry, and sexism, misogyny than I saw in the last 6 years in South Africa. I was utterly appalled. Again, I look back on that time now, and at the time, I thought walking away was absolutely the right thing to do. And I do know that just on the basis of what I said, they took the two managers who were responsible for this and put them in sort of much smaller shops. But nevertheless, they remain precisely. But I look back on that time, and I was just past 30, and the people who were working in that store were kids, and I had the luxury of walking away because if worse came to worse, I could have picked up the phone to my dad and asked him if I could borrow some money. They didn't have the luxury of walking away, and every morning these two managers would do this supposed sales pep talk it was racist, it was Islamophobic, it was sexist. And these kids, when the two managers disappeared, it was in a basement room. I can always remember this. They'd all disappear in floods of tears about the way, and then they'd have to go out and sell. Yeah, and they didn't have the luxury of walking away. I did, and there is quite a big part of me that looks back on that time and thinks that walking away was not the right thing to do, and I should have stayed and made sure that this was dealt with properly, rather than just the two people being sort of pushed out to other stores. And I went from that job to another one, which was sort of almost the opposite end of the scale. It was working in a bank, and it is the most boring job I've ever had. They employed 8 of us to do a job that probably needed 2 people, and then I got an opportunity to move to Westminster on a temporary contract to do, and you've sort of talked through her. So came into local government, no idea what to expect. Public sector in South Africa had a very bad name, and I loved Westminster at the time. It had a real rhythm to it. It was outward looking. It was innovative. It was great. It was great.
Obviously, your view of local government even back then of Westminster was that it was a good place to work.
Yeah.
And you obviously did those roles, and you became a head of service, and then you made yet another move to the Isle of Wight this time to become their director of economy and waste. So quite a big jump, both in terms of manager to director, but also going from Westminster to essentially an island. So tell us about that role and your move. I can imagine it was about getting more experience, but tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I loved Westminster.
Yeah.
I always wanted to be in London. I always wanted to come back to Westminster.
So you knew that?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
But I left because I also knew Westminster was a massively siloed organisation. And you were literally waiting to fill dead men's shoes. And I will come back to that because, and I'm purposely choosing to use men. I went down to the Isle of Wight to a director level job, a huge step up for me. And my experience, my view is that this, in local government terms, a step from head of service to director is the biggest step. It was for me. The kind of corporate responsibility that came at director level was a very big step compared to head of service. And the thing about the Isle of Wight, again, it's a place that people can often associate with affluence and the sort of yachting community. It has a huge amount of deprivation and very significant challenges, particularly in the education space, lack of ambition and aspiration, because the island doesn't have a university, that jobs are often seasonal, etc. And but being in a smaller organisation, I was given responsibility for a very wide range of areas of the council, including some corporate areas in my time there, and I got to see how the whole of the local authority ran, rather than if I had stayed here, I would have just been in. And I had some of the most challenging times of my career were at the Isle of Wight.
Right.
And you don't realize it at the time, but they absolutely were preparing me for this job.
Yeah.
Because the lessons I learned from that are really important to my ability to do this job.
So tell us about some of those lessons, because you were there for 7 years.
I was, yeah.
So tell us about some of those things that you learned.
Well, I'll give you one example. I'd been there about 3 months, and I was given responsibility. Well, sorry, I'd been there about 3 months, and something went wrong in planning. In essence, the leader of the council had turned up at a planning committee where one of his administration was putting forward a planning application to change her. Basically, it was completely against every planning policy.
Okay.
And he turned up at the planning committee meeting and sort of harumphed and harangued and heckled the officers. And the entire planning committee voted to pass this application. And at the time, the Isle of Wight had a cooling off period that the head of planning could invoke, where he felt that it was a he at the time, felt that the decision was perverse and there was no justification in planning terms, which he duly did. And the then chief executive of the council said to me, Stuart, can you just deal with this and sort it out? I wasn't responsible for planning at the time. Been at the council about 3 months. So I step into this, and I had, at various points in time, I had the deputy leader of the council threatening me and the head of planning that we had to change the officer recommendation to approval. At one stage, I had to go and sit in front of the planning committee and tell them that when the application returned for decision, if they voted in favour again and against the officer recommendation, I would have no choice but to report them to the Standards Board for England as existed in those days. And I'll never forget this. It was in an old style council chamber, and I was very grateful that I was sitting on the stage of the dais, but with a one of those big old kind of oak desk type things in front of me, because my legs were shaking. I was literally visibly shaking. And that resulted in them writing emails to the chief executive saying that I was bullying them, et cetera, et cetera. And it sort of culminated in the deputy leader sitting me down and insisting again with a couple of the planners in the room, insisting again that I get the officer to change their recommendation. There was no basis for this. And I flat refused. And he said, well, who is responsible? The chief executive had removed himself from all of this and basically left it to me. So I said to him, it's my decision. I'm very clear I'm not going to do what you are suggesting. So he said, well, in that case, I am going to speak to the cabinet, and we're going to have a vote of no confidence in you and in the planning function. And I said to him, well, look, if that's what you're going to do, that's what you have to do. But that is not going to change the position. Some of the things, just before I get to what eventually happened, I was impossible to live with. I was sleeping downstairs on the sofa. My friends couldn't come anywhere near me. I was a nightmare. I took this out on the people around me. And when I was applying for this job, I told this story to another London chief executive at the time, and she said to me, I was quite surprised actually, but it was a good lesson for me. She turned around to me, and instead of sort of any empathy or sympathy, she said to me, Stuart, if that's how you respond to something like that, you can't be a chief executive. And it made me realize, and what she said was, if you're going to take the stuff out on your family and your friends every time, then because this becomes something that, so that has absolutely stuck with me.
Yeah.
So anyway, the long and the short of it is that the deputy leader and leader did call for a vote of no confidence. I had a cabinet member we all had offices in those days, walking to my office and say to me, Stuart, this is going to happen. They're calling it, and they're going to win the vote. And I sat there thinking, oh, right. So this is, I'm 3 months as a director, and I'm gone. And what actually transpired is this same cabinet member walked into that room and said to the leader and the deputy leader, what you're doing is despicable. I would have no part of it. I am resigning from the cabinet. And he walked out, and that precipitated every other member of the cabinet walking out. I, in the end, did make a complaint to the Standards Board of England against both the leader and the deputy leader, and as a result, the leader was banned from office for 12 months and the deputy leader for 6 months, both of them from holding public office. And then one of the other things alongside how I deal with things as a person when this happens was, and by the way, there are obviously things that happen that keep me awake at night. There are things that happen where I don't, we are all human. But without, again, going too much into the detail, within a couple of months of me becoming chief executive, a scandal broke here to do with gifts and hospitality and the then deputy leader of the council, etc. And again, my experience on the Isle of Wight, where this stuff was, it was public in terms of just the island, but not beyond that, meant that I knew what to do. I was confident in my abilities to be able to deal with this. And I think that the politicians quite quickly saw me as a chief executive because I had to in that space. And so I think for me, that kind of example where you learn from adversity is really,
Absolutely. And we know that there are new standards for members being developed. There's a huge amount of training and support. And it's not often you hear about that level of detail about what happens. As you say, in your formative years of your career, it literally was your career on the line, but that you've learned from that. And it still shocks, doesn't it, to hear those examples. And one hopes you don't hear as many, but sadly, there are still cases like that, not necessarily in the planning sphere, but thank you for sharing that. So after those 7 years of tough work at the Isle of Wight, you then moved across to Southampton as a director of place, as environment and economy, a bit of a sideways move there. So talk to us about that. And that was, of course, the last role that you had before you came back here to then become the exec director for city management and communities. So tell us about those two roles before we then jump into your chief exec role.
So if you don't mind, if I can just say that the sideways move to Southampton was intentional because I wanted to get city experience back on my CV in order to come back here. I also just want to say, while I was on the Isle of Wight, and this to an extent in Southampton as well, I had 3 chief executives who all used me without this being a job title, effectively as their deputy, which means going back to the formative stuff, I got to sit up front in full council when the chief executive was not there for whatever reason. Again, people outside of local government won't necessarily understand that, but it's the kind of thing that you, as a new chief executive, you don't get to do, and it's odd that you suddenly find yourself sat in, I got to sit alongside the leader and advise the leader in cabinet meetings. All of those kinds of things were incredible, and I'm very grateful to those chief executives for giving me those opportunities. Because again, it helped me immensely when I did step into this role. The other thing is, when I was on the Isle of Wight, I had a chief executive who he'd actually been Newham's chief executive for 8 years, and he'd come to the Isle of Wight and as an interim. And anyway, he was a lovely guy, and he sat me down at one point and he said to me, "Stuart, your next step is chief executive, and you've got to think long and hard about this because it needs to be a place that you want to be at, because it is a long-term commitment, and so see it as a long-term commitment and think about the place and the people, and is it somewhere you want to be?" And actually, that was one of the things that pushed me to go to Southampton because and when I left, he said to me, when I told him I was going, he said to me, "Oh, you were my succession." And I did say to him that the truth is, I've been here over 7 years now, and my heart's not in it to the extent that you have said to me it needs to be. And so I think, So I moved to Southampton, as I said, to get city experience back on my CV. I was there less than a year.
Yes, I was going to say it was quite a short stay there before you then came back. So at that point, well, you said you always wanted to come back to Westminster. Did you know you always wanted to be the chief exec?
I knew that Westminster was the only place in local government I wanted to be chief exec of. It's slightly different. I hadn't plotted that my path would end up being as direct as it was, but. But just to say, when I left Southampton, and this for me is quite important in terms of all of senior roles in local government, the leader of the council at my last full council meeting stood up and he gave a speech about me, and I was shocked actually, because I was really worried that they were all going to sort of hate me for exactly. And one of the things he said is that what he really appreciated about me, and the reason why I wanted to say something, was because I was not one of those senior officers who saw, an ivory tower in the town hall, but went out and spent time in the community getting my hands dirty and all of the rest. What this all boiled down to was, as a ward councillor, he'd had an issue with allotments, and it was sort of,
Allotments are always contagious.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. And I do love doing stuff like that. So I went down to the allotments and met with the people who were sort of not getting on with each other, and tried my best. I mean, I never actually solved the problem. I tried my best to work with them and kind of be a bit of a mediator. And that's why he wanted to say something. Yeah. And I think I have seen a number of people fail at senior level in local government, where they suddenly think, well, my job is now strategic. And there is no such thing as strategic only. I don't think generally, but in local government, and also just to think that you can float and not, and you have to do the strategic, but in order to do that, you need to have an understanding of what's happening, on the ground, in the organisation, in our communities, etc. So yeah, I left Southampton because the person who originally appointed me in Westminster, he was a lovely man, and I'm still friends with him, but it took his retirement for everything to shift again in Westminster, which comes back to the point I made about you waiting to, so yeah, I came back to Westminster in 2015.
Took up the chief exec role 3 years later, didn't you?
Yeah.
And so that director of city management and communities, tell us what that role was. What did you do in that?
So that was looking after waste, highways, public protection licensing, mainly those three areas.
Big, visible, universal services in a borough this complex. It's tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, and we've experienced this when we recruited to that role subsequently, it was half the scope of the two jobs I'd done before. So if you look at Isle of Wight and Southampton, that included all of the other stuff like planning, the economic development, et cetera, et cetera. And in Westminster, that has been split. And in essence, it's whilst the scope, the breadth of the scope might have been bigger, the fact is that those services are a lot more demanding. So yeah, I came back to an organisation, if you don't mind me saying this now, that had lost its way, had fallen down the pecking order in the context of London, especially. It was seen as pretty average in London terms. Our staff were saying the same thing, in terms of what it felt like to work here, which I was really surprised by. And I came back to an organisation that was largely being run by the same 50 white men who'd been running it when I left. And what I mean by that is the organisation that I came back to had something called the corporate leadership team. And the corporate leadership team was supposedly the top 50 managers in the organisation. And my predecessor, the chief of staff, who joined the council 6 months before I came back, and she told me that the first time she walked into one of those meetings was like walking to a brick wall. There's 50 people in the room, 2 women, and everybody's white. And I mean, how that can be reflective of, and certainly wasn't, of the organisation, of the city, of our responsibilities. And to my mind, that absolutely is part of the reason why Westminster had lost its way, why it hadn't done anything innovative for a very long time. It wasn't outward looking either. We were quite arrogant. We were very inward looking. I'll stop there because again,
we'll absolutely get into that. So you took up the role, as you say. You clearly only wanted to be a chief exec here. One of the things I try and do in this podcast is try and open up what a typical day looks like for a chief exec, Stuart. So I know there is no such thing as a typical day, but tell us a little bit about what you do. And you've talked about being the strategic and on the ground. Tell us what a day being the chief exec of Westminster is like.
It's incredibly busy and I love it. And this will be the same everywhere. So I'm not going to sit here and say Westminster's unique, because I think these jobs are a privilege wherever we do them. I think it's an amazing thing to have leadership responsibility. I think particularly in local government, what we're responsible for and seeing what we can deliver and what we do and actually seeing that happen is incredible. And that all of these jobs are a privilege. So, yeah, it's incredibly busy, and you're asking me the question 6 months out from our next local elections.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I find myself at the moment bouncing between the pressures of the next 6 months, and obviously we have currently a Labour administration and a Conservative opposition, and the electioneering campaigning is well underway, and so there's a real there's pressure on that front. And then at the same time, organisationally, we've got the Fair Funding Review and all the changes that are happening in local government, and I'm also trying to get the organisation to think 3, 5, 10 years down the line. That's critically important. We've got the opportunity to do that. I love that. And so at the moment, I'm bouncing between the sort of next 6 months and the future. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the job here entails everything from, again, I had a very surreal experience. I sit on something called the Buckingham Palace Renewal and Restoration Programme Board, which is in essence a board of. I'm there because of the job title, not because of me, but we are helping to oversee and provide a bit of challenge for the money that's going to the effectively the refurbishment of Buckingham Palace. The first ever meeting I did there, the meeting was in the room where the balcony is, where the royal family go and stand and wave. So they said we all went and stood there, and I just thought, how is this just idiot from South Africa found himself stood in the balcony? Yeah. And then I literally walked back into the office and got a phone call from somebody, a resident, elderly woman, winter, her boiler had broken. And you just think like
that levels you, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, what's more important? Absolutely, the boiler is more important. So yeah, I mean, the breadth and how and again, that applies to the whole of local government is huge, and I love it.
Oh, that's fantastic! Thank you for that insight. And I'm really interested in hearing about. You talked about an organisation with the same 50 white men at the top, and clearly you've been here for a while. And I'll be really interested, Stuart, to hear about how you have gone about transforming that organisation. And we'll get into some of that detail. But you just made reference to the political piece and elections. And when I was kind of doing my research, what I hadn't appreciated was that, as you mentioned, you've got a Labour authority. But preceding that, until 2022, you had a Conservative administration here for 58 years consecutively. So in 2022, when it did suddenly swap overnight, what did that do to the organisation? Was it a shock? And how did you prepare as a chief executive? And you always prepare, don't you? Because politics is uncertain. But tell us about that after 58 years, what that must have felt like.
For the entirety of its existence, Westminster City Council had been Conservative until 2022. I'm going to say it was more surprise than shock. I don't think many people predicted that Labour would win the council in 2022. In fact, in his first interview as the leader of the council, Councillor Hugg, our current leader, said nobody's more surprised than me. So, it was. So from that point of view, I would say surprise rather than shock. I also had, at a senior officer level, worked through 2 previous changes where
leader
of administration.
Right. Okay.
And so I had a little bit of experience of what had happened in other places. So I had done some preparatory work. I had a plan that would have entailed me briefing and spending time over the weekend and of course the best laid plans and all of that. Yes. They were far too busy sort of celebrating and then wanting to spend time with me working out the process stuff. But I found this to be an incredibly smooth change of administration. The current administration came in with a lot of humility. They said to me, Stuart, we're going to make mistakes. Please just help us. And that was helpful to me because I was able to say, I'm going to make mistakes too. So, we worked together on this. But yeah, we obviously had a plan of what we needed to brief the members on, what we needed them to get going quite quickly. So for me, as I say, this was, I think I'm not the most experienced person in terms of changes of administration, but I've found it pretty exemplary, actually, the way that the whole thing operated.
And one of the first things they did was launch that, and you referred to an independent commission to help deliver, and I quote, affair of Westminster, which gave them over 100 recommendations. Talk us through you've talked about the smooth transition, but the cultural change that you've had to bring about to pivot to those new political priorities and realities for a workforce that hadn't known, probably, yes, there'd been probably different leaders, but the same political hue for so long.
Yeah. Again, I think that was culturally, I don't think that was an issue. The culture of our organisation, we had, and we'll come back to this, I know, but we'd done a lot of work on the culture of the organisation, and the culture of the organisation itself didn't change with the change of administration. It didn't really need to. And it's interesting because the Adam constantly used to talk to me about culture, and it took me a while to understand what he meant by culture, because we were talking at cross purposes. So culturally, the organisation, I don't think it was an issue really, and the change in political priorities, it was quite easy to pivot the organisation to get behind those. Where the biggest challenge actually was, and where I've made a number of mistakes, was going back to what I'd said previously about this being a siloed organisation in the past. We still are quite siloed. One of our biggest challenges that our staff constantly tell us is we need to be better at collaboration and, those interdependencies and all the rest. And there were things that were really important to this administration where I got a few people in the room and said, right, this is really important. This is how we're going to do it. You're all going to work together, aren't you? Great, fine. And walked away and thought, okay, that's brilliant. And they didn't. No. And it's not because people are bad people or anything else. It's just because people are busy and they go. And so that really concerted focus on getting us to work differently in terms of collaboration, working across the council, which, as I've said, we're still not brilliant at. We got a lot better, but we're still not brilliant at, was probably the biggest challenge. And I think probably also for the new administration, one of their biggest frustrations was just trying to help break down those sort of barriers, perceived and otherwise, between the different bits of the organisation.
So, as we've both talked about, this elections in May in London, there are a number of chief execs that are already beginning to talk about there will be changes, even if they're at the fringes. We have a different political reality within which we're now operating. What advice can you give to those that might see changes coming forward?
So I think one of the things that has always stood me in good stead in local government is I have treated all members the same. Again, on the Isle of Wight, when I had left the Isle of Wight, there was one solitary Labour member there at the time. We were at an independent administration when I left, and he stood up and gave a speech when I left, and he'd always given me a hard time.
That was his job.
Yeah, exactly. And I said to him, I'm really surprised, but he said, Stuart, you're the only officer that's ever treated me like, I'm important and have a role here.
He's democratically elected.
Yeah, exactly. And when the Labour administration came in here, I did have a conversation with the leader to say, look, am I the person that you want as your chief executive? Because I do that relationship's critical. And again, he said to me that he knew from his conversation with when he was in opposition with other opposition leaders, etc., that I worked very productively and collaboratively with him and gave him a level of service that probably most others weren't getting. And for me, we have a cabinet, we have an executive, we have an administration, and I obviously absolutely understand their role versus the role of opposition councillor. But at the end of the day, we are public servants, and our responsibility is to all councillors. And that's something that's been just part of who I've been in this role. And that stood me in really good stead to help the organisation transition, and also obviously with the politicians in terms of their views of me.
So your continuity was actually really helpful. Stuart, as you know, I continue to be vocal about the need to increase representation and diversity across the public sector. And this podcast, in part, is my small effort to try and bring forward more lived experiences and more diversity and get those stories out there. That, to me, and I know you, is really personal. And as a chief exec and leader of Westminster, I think it's fair to say from where I'm sitting, you've been one of the bravest and perhaps most strident in the work you have done here on EDI. You've given us a little bit of insight as to what you found when you entered here. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about the personal cost to you of doing that. But let's start by hearing the approach you've taken here on this agenda.
Yep. So the first thing I'm going to say is when I was interviewed for this job, I was actually asked a very helpful question by one of the cabinet members who said to me, what would my experience in South Africa bring to this role? And I spoke to, my answer to that question was all about the end of apartheid and that South Africa at the time absolutely needed a sledgehammer to deal with the crimes of the past. But that a sledgehammer wouldn't work in this country and that the problem was much more insidious. And if I was appointed into the role, I would go about tackling this issue in our organization and beyond, and having that at the heart of changing the culture of the organization. Because I had a light bulb moment when I was applying for this job. Every other job I've ever applied for, I've looked at the organization, including when I came back to Westminster, I worked out partly what I thought the politicians would want to hear. And so what I was selling was I will come there and I'll be able to deliver on what the organization's priorities are. This time, what I realized was I had to be saying, these are my priorities if you appoint me. Because if I didn't do that, and they appointed me, I wouldn't have the remit to get on and do what I was doing. So I spoke about EDI, I spoke about culture, I spoke about the economy in the context of seeing it more as a virtuous circle than rather just sort of heights of buildings and things like that. And that me speaking in my interview about the problem in our organization meant that when I was appointed, I had the mandate. That's the word I was looking for, Alder Van Reemers. Thank you. I had the mandate to get on and do what I needed to do. So is it okay if I just quote some statistics?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So when I came into this organization as chief executive, the organization at the time was 60% women, 40% men. We still are 60% women, 40% men. When you got to senior leadership, it flipped on its head. And I define senior leadership as head of service and above. So in our context, about 220 odd people. So at that level, 60% men, 40% women. When you then looked at global majority, and global majority is a term our staff have chosen to use, it's absolutely disgusting. So the organization at the time was 32% global majority, and only 5% of our senior leaders were global majority.
Right.
It's disgusting. And so I came in and I've spoke very openly about this to the organization from day one. I said, we've got problems. We need to address them. I'd seen too many of my predecessors when challenged on this, the stock answer was a sort of shrug of the shoulders and saying, well, that's because nobody ever applies for these jobs, and that just absolutely is not good enough. So I said to the organisation, we need to do something about this. And there's one person in particular, if it's okay, I'm going to name her. She's Serena Simon. She's an amazing person, been with the organisation about as long as I had at the time, actually. And when I first said this in a staff forum, Serena was uncharacteristically quiet. And she came up to me afterwards and she said to me, okay, Stuart, you said that, and what the hell are you going to do about it then? And I said to her, look, Serena, I don't know. I need help. And from that, I had an amazing head of organizational development, and we started developing a program of work for the council and to tackle this issue. And if it's okay, I just want to say a couple of things before I come back to the numbers. So I've always wanted to introduce, something along the lines of the Rooney Rule, which is something that comes from American football. And in essence, it means that there's a requirement to have a diverse shortlist when you're appointing at senior levels. And I kept having one HR director after the next and one HR lawyer after the next say, you can't do this, it's unlawful. And then we were required at roughly the same time that all of this was going on to publish our gender pay gap.
Yeah.
And I asked that I saw the ethnicity pay gap at the same time. And we do publish and have from day one published our ethnicity pay gap alongside our gender pay gap. And I hope that the government changes the law to require organisations to publish their ethnicity pay gaps as well. And what was presented to me was a gender pay gap that I'm sort of going with the worst of the mean and the median, but gender pay gap that was 11% and an ethnicity pay gap that was 18%, which just utterly unacceptable. And I did say at that point, I'm not now taking no for an answer. You will go away and tell me how we can make this work in our organisation. And we subsequently did that. We introduced a positive action, which at the time was all band 4 and above jobs needed to have a diverse shortlist. This is something that's hugely important to me because you spoke previously about the personal toll that this has taken on me. I'm less concerned about that than I am about the shocking rhetoric around EDI or DEI that appears it is, whether it's driven from the States or not, it happens in this country as well. And all journalism falls into this trap of equating EDI to giving people jobs other than on merit. And that is so undermining of the people in those jobs. And we should be doing everything we can to counter that because it is utter nonsense. It is about creating equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And just by having diverse shortlists, people are getting jobs on merit. Absolutely. You only get on the shortlist on merit in the first place. And that has had such a significant impact on the demographics of our senior leadership and our organisation as a whole.
Stuart, tell us a bit more about the data.
Thank you. So alongside the affirmative of the positive action approach, we've done a number of things, reverse mentoring, and we've had a number of other programs of work that have been focused on tackling the EDI and the issues in our organisation. So if you fast forward to where we are now, our senior leadership is now 53% women.
Okay.
So big change, still some distance to go to get to the 60%, which, I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be reflective of the whole organisation. And we are also at 34% global majority, so 5% to 34%, which is great.
Huge strides.
Yeah. But if you remember, I said our organisation 7.5 years ago was 32% global majority. We've also, and this is a real positive, the whole demographics of the organisation have shifted. We're now 44% global majority. And that's amazing because we now have global majority staff who see Westminster as a place to have and grow and develop a career, which was not the case previously.
Yeah.
Our pay gaps have reduced. The gender pay gap has reduced significantly. The ethnicity pay gap has dropped, but has now sort of stubbornly flatlined, and we're looking at what else we can do to continue to drive that down. The approach to EDI is embedded in the organisation. We've just had a peer review. It's told us that. And that is massively important for me because people always, until recently, used to say to me, Stuart, what happens when you go and this all stops?
Absolutely.
And my answer to that, if my departure means that this stops, then my time here has been an abject failure because this cannot be about one person or one person's leadership. It's got to be about all of us. It's got to be embedded in the culture of the organisation. And our senior leaders now know that this is every discussion, every decision. It's become part of the DNA of how the organisation operates. And any organisation represents the values of its leaders. So having leaders who lead authentically in the space is the way to affect that change. And so we've seen massive change, and that's just brilliant, but a long way to go.
Absolutely. And I think you're certainly somebody that is very self-critical and is very open about what you still need to do. But I know I was, obviously spending some time researching the work that you've done here, and I was quite shocked at some of the language that's been in the press around the work that you have led here. And I quote, you've been accused of introducing racist hiring policies, also, quote, white privilege test in an effort to combat unconscious bias. These kinds of attacks are levelled both at you as an individual, as a leader, and your organisation. Tell us the impact of that. I also read Westminster in the press, and the fact that, you were putting up, allowing pride flags to go up in Regent Street again, being heavily criticised. This has been personal against you from everything I've read, Stuart, as well as that against your organisation. So Tell us what that's like.
I think I find this question really, really challenging. In as much as yes, some of this has been personal against me, but that's not the issue. The issue is the impact it has on everybody else who is affected by this, being part of it, trying to help drive the change. The fact that the rhetoric just fuels this absolute nonsense about what DEI is. And by the way, I never actually once, people who know me know that's not the kind of thing I do. I've never actually once referred to Westminster as Wokeminster.
Sure you haven't.
So I'm less concerned about the impact on me than I am on the people around me. I also know that the people around me do need to see the support of the organisation, etc., when this happens, so that they have the confidence that if something similar happened to them, that they would also have that support. And but ultimately, I do lead with my heart on my sleeve. I know that that's not something that I am capable of changing. We want to change. I will continue to push very hard and lead in for what I believe is right. I think it's important to say, going back to the culture of the organisation, when this first started 7.5 years ago, we have an annual staff survey called Our Voice. We have a number of scores that contribute to an overall engagement score. And engagement is basically what it feels like to work here and be part of this organisation. When I came into this role, that score was 65%, which at the time was average in local government terms. 7.5 years later, it's been on a steady upward trajectory. This year, 70% of our staff responded, which is a very good response rate, and the engagement score is at 80%. So our organisation, everybody in our organisation, all of the demographics, 80% of our staff are saying this is a great place to be. We feel we can turn up here and be ourselves. We like what's happening. And actually, we want to be part of this organisation, making this organisation a great place to work. And so what I'm trying to say is that nonsense that gets put out there is absolutely, can be completely blown out of the water by what our staff are telling us. Really importantly, what our residents are telling us. Our resident satisfaction is amazing. I mean, I don't come at this from the point of view of arrogance, but the reason why we do all of this is ultimately, for me, there's a real moral imperative, but actually what it does is it drives better outcomes for our communities. And our communities are telling us to keep going. They're telling us that satisfaction rates are, at sky high. We're 35% higher than the local government average. It's so all of these things together say we're doing the right thing, we're going in the right direction. I absolutely, though, want to say, I'm not sitting here saying we've solved the problem. I'm not sitting here saying, I've made loads of mistakes, and no doubt I will make more. Important is acknowledge, learn from, and keep moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. And you rightly won the CEO of the Year award for the 2023 Inclusive Awards, recognising your commitment to EDI. Stuart, I'm very sat here as I'm listening to you and the journey you've taken Westminster on, and actually, where London was at. I can't but reflect on the difficult times we are experiencing, both nationally but also within this fantastic global city. We did some work also across the sector in my Solace role that said that no region in the country reflects its communities in terms of local government representation. We are in really difficult times, whether that's at a global level or national context, whether that's asylum hotels or flags. And through one lens, things are going the wrong way. What's your advice for colleagues, senior leaders? Because I only feel sadly that times are going to get harder in the short term. And given your experience and your background and your history and where you come from, what's your advice around how leaders lead in these really, really difficult times?
Yeah. I think what needs to happen is more people in senior leadership positions in the public sector need to stand up against this. And the public sector is still predominantly white in terms of its leadership. And that means white leaders need to stand up against this. We need to stand up and that awful, we had them on Westminster streets a month or so ago. And the racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and misogyny that comes out of all of that it cannot be excused. And I think we need to stand up against that. We need to call it out. I have done that in my organization. I do it externally where there is an opportunity to, and it's doing that knowing that there will be undoubtedly some form of repercussions in the current climate. I think, somebody said to me the other day, you mentioned the white privilege test, which, by the way, wasn't actually ever a thing. I mean,
I'm sure
but it was somebody in our organization basically found this. I think it had only been accessed about 40 times. It was on a shared drive somewhere and sent it to the press. And somebody said to me, "Oh, Stuart, spaces that used to be safe are no longer safe." And my response to that was, I don't think that's the case. I think the same people are still there. It's just these people are now being given a platform that they weren't previously. So yeah, I think my advice is that senior local government leaders, particularly white local government leaders, because we are still predominantly white, as I've said, need to stand up against this, need to speak out against it on behalf of all of our communities. And the more of us that do that, the more there ultimately is safety in numbers. I don't think we have the right, if that's the right word to use, to put our heads below the parapet. We don't. We have a responsibility in these jobs, and we have to. As I've said before, it's a privilege, but that privilege comes with responsibility. I think I hear quite a lot of people in the public sector excusing the behaviours of people in that kind of when we've had the riots and the racism and everything else post the general election. The immediate reaction was to excuse, and I'm not sitting here saying that we don't have a responsibility to think about and address some of the underlying issues that are causing people to behave in that way. We absolutely do, but that the starting point has got to be to say it's not okay to turn up and set an asylum hotel on fire. It's not. I mean, it's and so stand up to it. Think a little bit about what can be done to address the underlying causes of why people are turning up on our streets, but don't excuse it.
Thank you, Stuart. And what that makes me reflect on is we, as chief execs, never want to be the headlines. It's always our directly elected members that should be in that space. And I certainly know nationally, having the privilege, there are members that are having to really carefully navigate that really difficult line. And that's only going to get harder. You've talked about us all needing to stand up. What can chief execs practically do, recognising the democratic context within which they operate? So what can they practically do?
So in our case, as I said, I've done that in the organisation, and I'm not saying that I've made everybody happy. There are people who and helpfully are quite happy to challenge me, and I talk to the police about this a lot, and obviously in London's context with the Metropolitan Police Service and all the challenges there. Charing Cross Police Station, which was the Panorama, is in Westminster. Our BCU commander is fantastic, by the way. She's absolutely brilliant. We have set up something in Westminster called the Westminster Anti-Racist Partnership, which is convened by the council but brings together the police, health, fire, VCS, with a view to what we can do to make Westminster as a place an anti-racist place. So I think what I'm trying to say is there are things that we can do that are not about getting our names in the, because that's not ever what's driven me. In fact, one of the things I love about London is the ability to be much more anonymous than in the smaller places I worked where you just were.
Isle of Wight, you couldn't hide.
No, exactly. So yeah, I think doing what we can do in our organisations, so that our staff see and feel the support. And I mean, again, we still have lots of people who are very scared, because of what's gone on. Our partners,
Yeah.
You know, we spend massive amount of money as local government through contracts and other bits and pieces. So working with our partners, not just those who we contract with, but, you know, again, just using Westminster's case, we have the great estates. We have lots of private sector partners in Westminster, working with them as well. I believe so much in hope, and it's such an important thing to me. And I don't want to be naive. I also don't want this to sound as if it's coming entirely from my place of privilege, because I get that I will see the world differently and experience the world differently, more importantly, than people who are being very directly affected by this. But somebody said to me the other day that she feels the tide is beginning to turn, and I am sensing that as well. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you in as much as I think there is a possibility it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. But when I talk to leaders, again, you know, a lot of them in the private sector, they are white men like me. They are saying to me, this is not okay. That, like, we absolutely do not in any way agree with what's going on at the moment. And whilst they are not going to come out and publicly say that, what the hope that gives me is that's what they will be saying in their organization. So their staff will be hearing this and beginning to, so I think, you know, I think I'm hoping that there will be a point in the not too distant future where the groundswell is going to really push very hard against some of the awful far right and extreme right stuff that we are seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Stuart, for sharing your insights, your hope, which I think is really, really important, but also recognising that, as you've said, every leader has a responsibility in public service to have a view and to be able to share that, even if it's within their organisation, if they don't feel strong enough to be able to do anything beyond that. And I think I want to share that view of hope as we move into the future.
Can I say one more thing? And you feel free to edit this out. In this whole context, and you said about the stuff that I'm being attacked on, one of the things, I have said this to our organisation, but one of the things that that absolutely says those attacks are racist is, I've mentioned to you gender and ethnicity. I've spoken about gender and ethnicity in terms of representation, in terms of pay gaps, etc. And throughout, my approach has been, we've got to address both of those issues. They are the two big burning issues in our organisation. Never once have I been attacked on gender.
Right. Never once.
Only on race. And I can tell you that if we only had a gender issue and I was trying to do something about it, nobody would bat an eyelid. There would be... So the second you introduce race, and I'm really sorry to say this, because again, I feel guilty saying this, sat in my position here as, you know, my privilege as a white man, but you introduce race into the conversation, it becomes difficult, it becomes challenging, it leads to people writing the utter nonsense that they do, that the mainstream media in this country has picked up, not about me personally, but just this general thing about what EDI is, and it's, you know, so all of those things that get written about anti-white, etc., have racism written through them in what they are saying, because I've never been challenged on tackling the gender inequality that has existed and continues to exist in our organisation.
Thank you, Stuart. I think you and I could carry on talking just about this, but I want to move us on.
Yes.
Sometimes the things we do for the public good do catch the public imagination, and sometimes, unfortunately, it's in a negative way. And one of those is the Marble Arch Mound. It was meant to be a temporary structure post-pandemic to get people back into the city, and it turned into what I would describe as a PR disaster for the council, leading to one of your cabinet members having to resign and you having to instigate an internal review. And it found, and I quote, devastating and avoidable failures in project management, lack of oversight and attempts to conceal rising costs which tripled. The press, of course, went full on and talked of, you know, senior officers ignoring warnings, etc., etc. I would say in other authorities, that wouldn't have got the same press, but it went huge. Everybody heard about it. And it just meant you were under extra scrutiny. For a council that's got such a strong reputation for robust governance and tight controls, this probably came as a shock to you. Can you tell us what you learned about your leadership through that period, which it was intense?
It was. The first thing I'll say is a journalist friend of mine said to me, he always says to whoever he's talking to, whatever you do, don't mess up in the summer, because it is such a quiet news. And the Marble Arch Mound PR disaster happened at the beginning of summer, and there was nothing else going on. And so it was a story that ran and ran. Just taking a step back, we were coming out of the pandemic. We were desperately trying to find something to do to bring people back into central London. You know, we had all of the issues with Oxford Street, Regent Street, Bond Street, the low levels of footfall and even low levels of spend compared to previous. So what the Marble Arch Mound was we were looking to attract people back into central London. And I will not back away from that was the right thing to do. It's a moot point whether building the mound was the right thing to do, but you know, that was the intention behind it. It was then, as you said, probably the worst executed project I've ever seen, and I've seen some bad ones. Although, interestingly, as you've also pointed out, there were ones that cost a lot more money, but just didn't get the sort of media attention that this did. In the end, we actually ended up with we had a target number of people that we wanted to go up the mound when we built it, and that target was met. But yes, it was, you know, I've been given lots of poison or chalices or whatever you want to call it to deal with. This happened on my watch, though. I think, what did I learn about myself? I think one of the things that I was quite worried about and was the pressure that would be brought to bear on the organization to go down a micromanagement route, to introduce layers and layers of governance and I resisted that very strongly because this was not a failure of governance. Yes, absolutely, there were lessons that we could learn where we could be a little bit better and all of those things, and that's covered in the review. It wasn't a failure of governance. You know, you can't have process and governance that stops anything ever going wrong. So I resisted quite strongly that push for us to. And I'm not a micromanager, you know, so it's just not in me. The other thing that really worried me, and to an extent it remains the case, and I think this is a wider local government and probably public sector issue, is what it felt like to people in our organisation, and particularly what it felt like to people either being prepared to make a mistake and then own up to that mistake, because that's how you learn. And if the general thing is make a mistake, it's going to get blown up in the press and, you know, heads rolled and all of that, then who's ever going to admit to? So we've done a huge amount of work and continue to because, you know, as we transform and change as an organization, we look to the future and we see all of the changes that we need to bring in terms of how the whole sector needs to be looking at this, you know, what the workforce of the future looks like. We also have to acknowledge we're not going to, you know, there's no perfect roadmap for us, which I love. I love working without a roadmap and, you know, charting our own course and all of that. But that does mean we're going to make mistakes. It's really important, pick up on those mistakes, learn from them and keep going and keep getting better. So that, I guess those were the two big things for me not micromanaging and culturally the organisation being prepared to make mistakes.
But it's all right. Yeah. But it's okay. It's not always perfect. We're nearly at the end of our time together, sadly, but I wanted to just look out a bit more. And you've mentioned it earlier, fair funding review, something we've all been waiting for a long time. And it's predicted at the moment that inner London boroughs like Westminster are projected to be one of the biggest losers under the new formula. And even with what's now being called transitional protection, you're going to have between an 11 and 12% potential reduction. That's about £22 to £25 million reduction of your net budget. Tell us what you're now going to have to do. And you've talked about, I like looking at 6 months, 12 months, 5 years. Tell us what you're now starting to think about that this organisation is going to have to do differently given the fair funding outcome that's likely to come your way.
So we are doing a lot of work under the transformation banner. And I wouldn't mind just spending a bit of time on that. I worked on the Isle of Wight and in Southampton when austerity hit. And I saw and was part of the impacts of that. And it was devastating. And overnight, we had to take an axe to the organisation and make decisions that no politician or officer wanted to make, but we had no choice. And we did a lot of stuff there under the banner of transformation, which the truth is it wasn't transformation. Yeah. It was about meeting a financial challenge and doing it very, very quickly, and in a way that sometimes was just stopping doing lots of stuff. Here, I'm trying to take a different approach. We have brought in somebody as our chief operating officer. She's an amazing person, very experienced, been a chief executive, and also worked in other places and done similar things. And she's she's incredible and inspirational. But what I've purposely done is made her part of the executive leadership team. In other places, when we did this, we brought in a transformation director, reported to the chief executive, but sort of didn't form part of the team and was seen as, doing to the organisation rather than with. We've got the opportunity here to think about how we do this in a way that is managed, in a way that is exciting, in a way that deals with the challenges, but very much looking to the future, very much seeing our organisation as a again, this virtuous circle. So, when we start thinking about technology and the impact technology is going to have on jobs, yes, technology is likely to replace some of the jobs that we have in our organisation. But what we're doing now is we're thinking about where that's going to be, and we're offering people in those places opportunity to retrain for the types of roles that we know we're going to need in the future. There's no organisation, local government we are constantly changing and evolving, and so it's a very small example, but we have brought in an organisation to help us do this. We have contact center staff, and our contact center staff, they're amazing, by the way. They're low paid and also tend to be where we have a disproportionate, not quite the right, but proportionally higher level of Westminster residents working in our contact center. So one of the things we have by far the lowest numbers of residents working for the council, just because of the cost of property and everything else. So we're offering people in the contact center who want an opportunity to retrain with digital skills, and at the end of that there will be jobs, because we know those digital skills are what we're going to need going into the future. So we are planning to meet the financial challenge by doing things that are actually transformation rather than just sort of taking an axe to the organisation. We have the ability and the opportunity to not do that, and the responsibility actually to not do that. And so that's, as I've said, exciting. It's challenging. We're trying to get the whole organisation involved in this so that everybody is thinking differently about what the future might look like. And the things that we are talking about, clearly the politicians will need to ultimately agree with. They are very much about the running of the organisation rather than necessarily, reducing services out there. So we're very conscious, as I've mentioned already, we've got elections coming up in 6 months' time, and this will be an ongoing conversation.
Beyond that.
Yeah, beyond that. So, whatever we're doing now is, as I've said, it's not just about the next year's financial challenge is huge. The one after is big. The one after that is big. We've got to be thinking more about where we're going to be in 9 years' time. And, because the implications of those funding reductions now fundamentally change what the future of. So
Stuart, I must ask you, you're one of the longest serving chief execs in London. Recent data from London Council says that half of London local authorities in the next 4 or 5 years will require exceptional funding support from government. Do you think, like many other parts of the country which are now under Devo and LGR, do you think there will get to a point in the future where the number of boroughs is no longer sustainable?
I really, really hope so. And I know that is a controversial point of view, so I will say this is my own personal opinion. I think London's local government construct is bonkers. 33 of us. I once tried to explain this. I was in in the pandemic, I spoke to a bunch of people from Paris and all over France, actually. I was on a panel. And I tried to explain to them how London's, and I could see them all just shaking their heads at me on this Zoom call as was. Anyway, so yeah, I'm fully in favour of local government reform coming to London, and there being far fewer of us. I mean, and by far fewer, I think you could get away with a third of the number of local government. I also think part of that has to be the relationship between the mayor and local government, which doesn't work. I do like the combined authority type model that you see in places like Manchester, where the mayor and local government leaders have a seat at the table together and are responsible for the leadership of their place together. I'd be very much in favour of that. Just if I can say, as a case supporting local government reform in London, we have two. We have more than that, but two big by-borough services, so shared services with Kensington and Chelsea, our children's and our adult services. Our children's services, both Kensington and Westminster, were inspected independently by Ofsted. 3 inspections in a row outstanding for both Westminster and KNC. I think there's only one other local authority in the country that's had that. So that's incredible. We have outstanding children's services. And, giving people the best start in life and that equal start in life is absolutely got to be what this is all about. Adult social care, last year we had, both of us had our CQC inspections. Westminster, we were third best in the country rated from the inspections last year. KNC best in the country they were best or second best. KNC were amazing, and we run those services at a much lower cost than if they were sovereign,
right?
Because we would need to. We've done the numbers on this over the years in terms of what you'd need to do in order to
break it.
Yeah. And for me, right there is an argument for local government reform. We're delivering outstanding services at a lower cost because we're doing it together.
Yeah, and residents, no disrespect to us, don't really care where the service comes from.
Yeah.
It's actually just about their lives. We're sadly nearly towards the end of our time together, Stuart, and I always finish, as regular listeners will know, with the same two questions. Firstly, what's your one wish for the sector?
Oh, can I give you two things? Sorry. So the first thing is that we were better together. I think individually, local government's fantastic. We're amazing. And I saw this in the pandemic. I mean, I think every bit of local government did an amazing job. In the London context, the second we came together to try to do things together, that became much more challenging. And it feels like we should just be better together than we are. And so that's one thing I would be my wish for the sector. The second thing is I speak to far too many people who are senior officers in local government or aspiring senior officers who say to me, but I don't want to be a chief executive because that job looks so difficult. And as local government chief executives, we need to be a whole lot better at selling this job. It is an amazing job. If you think about the breadth of responsibility that you have, nowhere else in the world, in any job, do you get to do the stuff that we do. And really importantly, do you get to see the outcomes of decisions. The mayor of Washington, I'm name dropping, but I happened to be at a conference where she spoke. And she said, the best part of local government to be is local government. It's the only place where you can have an idea, make a decision, and see it happen in 12 months. And that's amazing. And it is true, exactly. It's absolutely true. So this job is a privilege. It comes with responsibility. It comes with challenge. It comes with a massive amount of excitement. So my second wish would be that we were much better at selling local government to people who are the leaders of the future.
I couldn't agree more. And then finally, Stuart, what will your legacy be in local government?
I really don't like the word legacy. In the context of local government, I have seen too many politicians and senior officers talk about personal legacy. This should never be about a personal legacy. But having said that, I did hear a description of legacy that I really like, actually. And the description was, true legacy is planting the seeds of trees under whose shade you will never sit. And that, for me, going back to, again, EDI, is when I go, it has to continue. And it has to continue and it has to get better. And it will get better because it'll be somebody else leading it. So So that's what I see as legacy. I really am not, as I've said, a fan of the idea of personal legacy.
Stuart, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your candour, for your inspiration, your honesty and frankness about your personal career journey, but also what's really clear, the journey that you've taken this phenomenal organisation on. So listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this as much as I have. And thanks, Stuart, from the bottom of my heart. I've really enjoyed speaking to you today.
Thank you. It's been thank you. It's been an absolute privilege, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this.
Hi there. Thanks for listening. Please do like, subscribe, share, and maybe give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or your listening platform of choice. We really look forward to your feedback.